Someone was telling a terrible story. There was a strange and very ancient custom of setting the table for the dead on Christmas Day. I haven't heard of it myself, but they say they used to do it. My sister and I were probably 15 years old at the time. Before moving to the city, we lived in the village. We had a big family. My mother and father, my sister and I, and my grandparents. My sister and I will remember what happened that Christmas night for the rest of our lives. Our grandmother was an old believer and revered all sorts of ancient customs, among which there was one downright creepy, setting a table for the dead at night for deceased relatives. I remember that she did it every year and nothing like that happened, but one day, the holiday came, we celebrated with our family, and by nightfall we were already going to bed in our rooms, and Grandma stayed in the kitchen to set the table for the deceased. Allegedly, on this night, heaven opens the way from the other world and the souls of the deceased come to earth. After she had prepared everything, she went to bed too, and my sister and I lay chatting for a long time. It was already about 2 o'clock in the morning or so when suddenly a sound was heard from the kitchen. The nurse said she didn't hear anything, but I'm sure someone moved the stool. After 5 minutes of silence, the sound returns. This time his sister heard him too. It sounded like someone tapping spoons on plates, as if scooping food. We got scared. The door to the room was ajar, and candles were burning in the kitchen, which was next to our room, and I could see through the crack in the door that some shadows were flickering in the candlelight. Then heavy footsteps were heard and, frightened, I slammed our door, closing it with a hook. Someone came up to our room and tried to get inside, but the door wouldn't budge. Then a low whisper was heard. We crawled under the covers out of fear, and my sister, unable to withstand this horror, began to scream loudly. In an instant everything was quiet, and behind the door his father's voice asked him to open it. Everyone woke up and started scolding us, saying, "Why are we bullying?" They didn't believe our story, but when they entered the kitchen, they were stunned. Food was scattered from the plates, wine was spilled all over the table, and stools were overturned on the floor. I myself do not know who came to us that night, relatives or someone else, but only after this incident did my father strictly forbid my grandmother to observe this custom, which she did. Apparently she was scared herself, because this had never happened before. One day on Christmas Eve, a family was going to visit their friends who lived in the village. On the 31st, in the afternoon, they packed up their things and gifts and set off on the road. The path along the highway was very long, and in order to pass the time on the road, the head of the family decided to take a shortcut through the forest. That is, they turned off the highway onto a turn and drove along a forest road. It had been dark outside for a long time. There was a terrible snowstorm. The wipers of the car could barely cope with their task. The road was poorly lit and the car was moving slowly. After driving some part of the way, strange things began to happen to the car. Then something knocks, then the engine suddenly starts to stall, then the steering wheel does not obey the driver's hands. The man decided to stop, and at the same second the snowstorm suddenly stopped. He thought it was all kind of weird. He got out of the car. He looked around. All around is an impenetrable winter forest consisting of fir trees and pines. It was already 10 o'clock. His wife and children were sleeping in the back seat when suddenly a howl was heard from the depths of the forest. But that howl was not like the usual howl of wolves, but like some kind of hoarse howl, as if someone was not even howling, but grunting. A black shadow appeared among the snow trees on the side of the road. She looked like a human, but somehow hunched over and seemed to limp. The man took a flashlight and started shining it at that place. The shadow was gone. Suddenly, there was a crunching of branches and the sound of footsteps behind him, as if someone was crunching snow underfoot. The head of the family abruptly turned on the spot and began to shine a lantern. A figure in red stood between two pines. A long red fur coat with a hood pulled over his head, under which there seemed to be no face, but only a black spot with burning eyes. The man believed in the fairy tale about Santa Claus for a second, but when the figure stepped towards him, rattling chains and letting out a roar, he saw horns sticking out of the hood on his head. Without realizing how he ended up in the car, the head of the family pressed the gas pedal all the way down and rushed away from this damned place. He heard, or perhaps it seemed to him, how the man in red was chasing him. It's like he's chasing a car through the air, but when he looked in the rearview mirror, he couldn't see anyone. I just heard the one with the horns rattling chains somewhere behind. An hour later, the car reached the village where their friends lived. Of course, no one believed his story, but they just laughed and decided that he decided to scare them all that Christmas night.